So there's a really interesting dynamic laid out in an analysis by Noah Smith over at Bloomberg that we wanted to bring to you. So there's a lot of talk about inequality, and especially at the very top of the income scale. So this has been manifestly on display during this pandemic as people like Jeff Bezos have gotten unimaginably richer. I think I saw some analysis that he has gained so much wealth during the pandemic that he could give every single one of his workers like $150,000 bonus, and that would just equate to like the amount of money that he personally has made during the pandemic. So that level of wealth inequality has been on wide display. But what Noah lays out in this piece is that within that inequality, those inequality statistics, is the fact that the middle class itself has really diverged. So you have these two growing, very distinct classes within the middle class, where the upper middle class and the lives that they lead and the jobs that they're able to aspire to and the things that they're able to do for their kids is becoming wildly divergent from the lower middle class and the opportunities that are ultimately available to them. Rachel, I think part of why you don't hear a lot of discussion about that is because the party that cares more about wealth inequality, the Democratic Party, their base is the upper middle class. Those are the most enthusiastic members of the party at this point. You saw that certainly in the data from this election, but you also saw it starting back in 2016 and even before that during the Barack Obama years and starting actually in the Clinton years. What do you make of this data, and what do you think kind of underlies it?
Well, I think it's a really insidious trend because, you know, when we talk about income mobility, we count on it happening in the middle class. Right? Like it's generally established that it's pretty difficult to go from like middle class to super wealthy. But we tell people, right, it's a prevailing narrative that, yeah, you know, if you start out lower middle class, you can move to upper middle class if you just, you know, do X, Y, or Z. That is an entrenched narrative in our policymaking. And this article is suggesting that it's not exactly true. And one of the interesting things about it, I think, is that, you know, even and I'm speaking from a right of center perspective, that we on the right are starting to grapple with that's the result of the policy choices that we have made, particularly around industrial offshoring and trade. And the article sort of drives by this, but I point it out because you are seeing a number of people on the right start to call that out to build intellectual centers around answering this question. I'm talking specifically about Oren Cass as a thinker in this direction. You know, but then I also wonder, too, on the left, you know, how the left starts to respond to this, because very often I see the conversations about inequality on the left focus more around race than they do around class. And I think that this article suggests that there might need to be more of an emphasis in the left's policymaking on sort of that class issue over one of race.
Well, and you can sort of see in the culture, too, an animosity between these two groups, right? The upper middle class are sort of like the typical, there's like a lot of brunch liberals there, right, who are watching MSNBC and looking down their nose at the, you know, less affluent members of the middle class. So a lot of times the contempt that you feel is more directly towards like the people who are closest to you in the rings of like the stratification of society. And so you see that animosity going back and forth between these two groups. And when you look at the numbers like this, you kind of understand it, right? Because those upper middle class people are terrified that their kids are going to fall out of the status and position that they've achieved. And people in the lower middle class feel completely stuck, looked down upon, treated with contempt and disdain, and like they can't possibly achieve the level of opportunity, not just for themselves, but for their kids, that these upper middle class people are sort of hoarding. There's a book called Dream Hoarders that talks about the way that they sort of suck up all the energy and all of the opportunities for themselves and their own children. And the more that you have that gap grow between these two groups, not just on an income level, but on a cultural level, on a sort of possibility for the future level, yeah, the more ugliness and more animosity that you're going to get between these two groups, the more stratification you're going to see in terms of which political parties are playing to which group and how that ultimately plays out. The factors that they lay out and suggest could be behind this divide in the piece are, one of them is, yes, the gutting of the industrial base, the allowing of jobs to be shipped offshore, whether that's, you know, through NAFTA and bad trade deals or through automation. But the gutting of that is like a solid middle class achievable lifestyle, especially in major cities. They also point to, and I think these things are probably related, the fact that there's more of a bonus that you get for going to college. So your wages increase a lot more. There's more of an education bonus, I guess, for going to college. And then they also point to, and this is another one that I think is really important, the decline in private sector unions. You know, when you're just one individual worker on your own, you have zero power, especially when you're talking about corporate behemoths like we have today, unchecked, places like Amazon and other tech giants. But in almost every sector in society, we have these massive monopolies combined with workers who have next to zero power because all the unions have been destroyed and busted.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, there's a resurgence of or renewed interest, I think, in private sector unions from people on the right and where the left has always had it. And I'm a little bit, you know, I do think that these local sort of private sector unions can have an important role. I'm a little skeptical of them in sort of public sector unions and the larger they get. But I think, you know, the article makes a good point in the broader narrative. The fact that our workforce has changed and our income mobility has changed. And that may require, well, it does require, I think, a renewed interest in some old policies or a rethinking of, you know, things that may have worked in the 80s to sort of, you know, turn the economy around in different areas may not work as well now. And it requires, I think, a reconsideration that, unfortunately, I think our politics are loath to take into account because we don't allow people for reconsideration to reconsider things anymore. We just tend to vote them out.
Yeah, and there's like a political bonus to be garnered from pitting people against each other instead of easing the pathways between the classes and creating that that chance for mobility. Rachel, thank you. Great analysis as always, and we will have more Rising for you after this.